Hello guys and gals, and welcome! So, I didn't get a chance to finish the Rogue overview while I was doing the Diablo 4 server slam, like I wanted to. And so I decided, let's do it now. I mean, I don't have access to the game right now, but I'd like to get this done before the game launches, because, well, let's be honest. When the game launches, I want to play. I don't want to have to be making a whole bunch of videos. I'll make those later. But right now, let's go over the Rogue and let's talk about the various skills that she has to offer and see if I can give you guys some insight. So this is the Rogue class overview video. First off, let's talk about these basic skills. Forceful Arrow is kind of interesting in that it does make monsters vulnerable when you shoot them. It's kind of a very large, powerful shot, and it has a rather high lucky hit chance. If you guys are unaware of the way that lucky hit chances work, is basically it's just a balancing mechanic for proc chance. So if you have played Diablo 2 in the past, and you've utilized any items that have high proc chances, like Voice of Reason, or I don't know, let's just use Voice of Reason as a very interesting option here, because it spams Frozen Orb, right? Well, if you were going to build a Frozen Orb Sorceress, or sorry, a Frozen Orb kicks in, you would probably not choose, one of the slower kicks like Dragonflight, because, well, you get much more advantage from choosing one of the faster kicks that hits more often, right? Well, that's how proc chances work, is that because proc chance is a percentage-based chance, the faster and quicker you can strike a target, the better you can dish out that proc ability, right? Well, Diablo 4 is trying to bring proc chance into the equation, but also give everybody a various way of still having a good time with a slower ability. So let's say you have an ability that's not quite as fast as the others. Well, they're going to give it a higher percent chance. So Heartseeker, for instance, has a lucky hit chance of 50%. And the reason why they did that was because Heartseeker is a little bit slower than some of the other abilities. The faster abilities have a lower lucky hit chance because they're going to hit more often and they're going to proc the effect more often. But by balancing it out in this way, by giving some of the slower abilities a higher chance and some of the faster abilities a lower chance, they're making it much more likely that you might actually choose a slower ability for proc chance, which is not the case in Diablo 2 at all, because in Diablo 2, you would obviously, if you wanted to specifically prioritize proc chance, you would go with a fast ability like Zeal, like one of the really fast kicks, or Strafe, Frenzy, Double Swing, those kind of things that have really fast attacks that will hit multiple times and have more chances to proc the abilities, right? Well, in Diablo 4, it's not so cut and dry. It's not just about picking the fastest ability, it's about picking the ability that works best with your build, and the lucky hit chance has all kind of been balanced out for you. So even though a skill might have a relatively low percentage chance of lucky hit, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to proc all the time, because if it attacks quickly and multiple times, it's going to have more chances than a skill like Heartseeker, which is lucky hit 50% chance, but attacks slower and has less chances. Now, getting into the skills, we were talking about Forceful Arrow. Now, Forceful Arrow has a 20% damage buff. Every third cast makes the enemy vulnerable for 2 seconds. You can beef up the Forceful Arrow with the every third cast. Forceful Arrow additionally has a 15% critical strike chance, which is pretty darn nice. So you get a 15% crit bonus on the third cast of the ability. Then on top of that, we also have 2 options for upgrade here, which is Primary Forceful Arrow, which pierces through vulnerable enemies. So this would be something that you would build if you were specifically trying to build a character around the vulnerable mechanic. And there's a lot of different abilities that can make monsters vulnerable. In fact, Forceful Arrow makes monsters vulnerable itself. But that's not the only skill and the only abilities that will allow you to add vulnerability. And you may build a character completely around the concept of, every single monster is vulnerable all the time. And so this piercing effect might be extremely valuable in that case. The other option is Forceful Arrows knock back non-elites if they are close. And from what we learned about close is within melee range. If they collide with another enemy, both are knocked down for 1.5 seconds. That's actually pretty nice. Knockdown is essentially like a stun. that's kind of the same thing. Monster basically can't move and can't do anything for 1.5 seconds, which is a pretty decent amount of time. Then we have Heartseeker. Now, Heartseeker has a arrow that is fired with a 22% damage and increasing your critical strike chance against them by 3% for 4 seconds, up to 15%. So it gets a stacking crit bonus, which is actually pretty nice. I use this in the beta quite a bit, and it's pretty much just like Guided Arrow from the Amazon in Diablo 2. So if you were a big fan of Guided Arrow, you may like Heartseeker. The first upgrade for Heartseeker is when Heartseeker critically strikes, gain 8% increased attack speed for 4 seconds, double this amount if the enemy is vulnerable. And then the 2 upgrade paths that you can choose is Heartseeker ricochets to additional enemies, dealing 30% of its original damage. This one is pretty good, and I had a lot of fun with the primary Heartseeker, which allows you to hit multiple targets. But then we also have the Heartseeker also increases the critical strike damage the enemy takes from you by 5 times for 5% for 4 seconds, up to 25%. So there's 2 different paths you can go here. You can get multiple hits, or you can get better crit damage. And it definitely does seem like Heartseeker is kind of designed around crits. So if you end up going with a crit build on the rogue, it makes a lot of sense to go with the fundamental Heartseeker over the primary. But the primary Heartseeker does have its advantages because it does hit multiple enemies. Turns Guided Arrow from a single target shot into a multi-target shot, which is nice. Although the multiple hits that come out afterward are not full damage. Then we have Puncture. Puncture is throwing your blades a short distance, dealing 21% damage. Every third cast slows enemies by 20% for 2 seconds. Critical strikes will always slow. So what this is this is something that you could use very well with a critical strike build. Or sorry, not critical strike, crowd control build. Crowd controls involve things like slows and other such effects, and I have a video on that, by the way, if you want to learn all of the effects. But basically anything that can constitutes a crowd control ability is going to add additional damage in many different ways. Well, this one gives you the ability to slow enemies, and if you crit, you always slow enemies. So you get some pretty nice crowd control effects from Puncture. Enhanced Puncture gains 2 energy when Puncture damages a crowd control enemy. So as I was talking about earlier, crowd control effects, and then right off the bat, what do we have? A bonus for if the monster is crowd controlled. So exactly what I'm talking about. The 2 upgrade options are every third cast of Puncture will also ricochet up to 2 times. Critical strikes will always ricochet. So we have 2 different things here going on with critical strikes. Critical strikes will always slow, and critical strikes will always ricochet. So 2 things right here which could be very handy for a critical strike build if you wanted to make a crit build. Crit builds are actually very fun, and a lot of my characters in MMOs usually ended up having crit builds, and it's nice to see big numbers. Fundamental Puncture is the other option, which is Puncture now throws 3 blades in a spread, each dealing 35% of its base damage. Hitting an enemy with at least 2 blades at once makes them vulnerable for 2 seconds. So in this particular case, you're now converting this into an AoE attack, a frontal cone AoE attack, with the ability to make them vulnerable as well. So 2 different paths here. One adds vulnerability, which could be useful later on for abilities specifically that have bonuses, for instance, about with vulnerability. Or you can go with the crit build, which is going to be pretty nice if you have a high crit percentage. Then we also have Blade Shift. Blade Shift is quickly stab your victim for 15% damage and shift, allowing you to move freely through enemies for 3 seconds. Now this one is kind of more of a movement ability, because not only does it dish out damage, but it also allows you to basically walk through monsters. Not quite what I think most people would think. Like, it's not going to speed you up or anything, but it will basically make it so that if you're surrounded by monsters, you'll be able to just pass right through them without collision. Enhanced Blade Shift. Damaging an enemy with Blade Shift grants 5% movement speed, while Blade Shift is active up to 20%. So now we have a freeing ability, which will let you walk through monsters without collision, which now also has movement attached to it. So a very good ability if you're trying to get high mobility. The two upgrade options for this are Fundamental Blade Shift. Moving through enemies while Blade Shift is active refreshes its duration. After moving through enemies 5 times, your next Blade Shift will daze enemies for 2 seconds. Now, daze will keep monsters from being able to attack you, but it doesn't stop them from chasing you. So please keep that in mind. Primary Blade Shift. While Blade Shift is active, you gain 15% to all non-physical resistances and reduce the duration of incoming crowd control parrying effects by 20%. This ability, to me, strikes me as not really an attack so much as a very nice way that you can free yourself from crowd control effects, group monsters that might be trying to harass you, get yourself out of dodge, so to speak, and even increase your physical resistances and your non-physical resistances, and reduce the duration of control and bearing effects. Overall, this looks like a very good one to take for a PvP character, because if you're ever in a situation where you get stuck, you can move out of it. You can utilize it to get faster movement speed so that you can flee. And on top of that, you can also make yourself tankier in the process and reduce the duration of the control pairing effects. So all in all, looks like to me a very interesting one for a PvP build. Invigorating Strike, melee attack an enemy, dealing 23% damage and increasing energy regeneration by 20% for 3 seconds. This is basically another way that you can get more resource. And of course, all of these are resource generators, but some of these are going to generate more resource than others. Enhanced Invigorating Strike. Damaging a crowd-controlled or injured enemy with Invigorating Strike increases its energy regeneration bonus up to 30%. So not only does this already have pretty good energy regeneration, but you can increase it even more by attacking crowd-controlled or injured enemies. Crowd-controlled enemies are specifically any monster which is under the effects of a crowd control doojank. Now, I actually do have a list of that here, and I feel like with this particular character, it might be a good idea if I bring these up on camera real quick. Let me see if I can bring these up for you guys. Beep, 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 beep. Oh, no. So this is my video if you want to check it out. It's a very short little short. There's really not much to it. But I put all the crowd control effects up on the screen so you guys will know what constitutes a crowd control effect and what doesn't. And the list is kind of long, and it doesn't include fire effects or some other effects that may or may not be considered crowd control. It is specifically these right here. So it is slows, immobilize, stun, knockback, knockdown, taunt, fear, tether, daze, chill, freeze, and also any boss that is under stagger is considered to be crowd control as well. So when we're talking about like stuns and crowd controls and things like that, that is the official list of what actually constitutes crowd control. And it's a lot of different things. Injured is 35% or lower HP, which means that it's only going to affect monsters that are basically almost dead. The two upgrade paths for Invigorating Strike are additionally grants 8% lucky hit chance. Hitting a crowd-controlled or injured enemy increases the bonus to 16%. So again, another crowd-controlled or injured enemy like bonus. And then on top of that, the other upgrade path is hitting an enemy with Invigorating Strike while you are below 50% energy makes them vulnerable for 3 seconds. So this would be a fun one if you were just constantly spending as much energy as you possibly could, because every single time you use Invigorating Strike, it would make them vulnerable, which would be nice. And that pretty much does it for the actual builders, is what I would call it, the energy builders. Basically, what we have here is we have 2 ranged, we have 2 melee, and then we have this one in the middle, which is kind of like a half pseudo melee ranged ability. It's a little strange. When you actually use it in game, you'll get what I mean, but it's like not really a true ranged ability because it doesn't go very far, but it's also not really a melee ability either because it does actually have some distance to it. And when you play around with it, you may or may not like it. Moving on to the next part of the tree, we have our core skills. And in our core skills, we have Barrage. Unleash a barrage of 5 arrows that expands outward, dealing 21% damage. Each arrow has a 20% chance to ricochet off an enemy up to 1 time. Ricochet deals 40% of the arrow's base damage. This is kind of like multi-shot. I don't want to say that it's exactly like multi-shot, but it's kind of like multi-shot. Like the way that it fires is a little bit different. It's more straight than it is like, you know how multi-shot kind of goes out like, shwee, and eventually it turns into a big, like it's a slice of pizza basically, right, with the crust at the top. Like this one kind of fires a little bit more straight, and you might like it if you're a multi-shot like Zon user, and you're interested in that sort of gameplay. The upgrades for this are Barrage Ricochet chance is increased to 100% for arrows that damage a vulnerable or critical strike an enemy. As you can see, there's a lot of this going on in the Rogue. A lot of, like, if the enemy is vulnerable, if you do a critical strike, if you have a crowd control effect. So, when you build these characters, these rogues, you really are kind of focusing on that kind of stuff. Like, you kind of want to choose. Just be like, okay, do I want crit? Do I want to do the vulnerable thing? Do I want to do the crowd control thing? Do I want to do all 3? I mean, like, there's tons of bonuses all over the place for this stuff. Now, the 2 upgrade paths for Barrage are whenever a single cast of Barrage ricochets at least 4 times, your next cast gains 20% increased critical strike chance. So, it's kind of nice. 20% crit bonus is certainly not bad. Improved Barrage, every 3rd cast of Barrage makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. So, again, another way to make enemies vulnerable. And you'll find that there's ways to make enemies vulnerable like all over this tree. Next is the Twisting Blades, and this is one that received quite a bit of a nerf back in Server Slam. It was super powerful in the beta, and then the Server Slam, they kind of hit it with a nerf bat, but it's still pretty powerful. Twisting Blades is impale an enemy with your blades, dealing 45% damage and making them take 8% increased damage from you while impaled. After 1.5 seconds, the blades return to you, piercing enemies for 72% damage. Enhanced Twisting Blades does 30% increased damage when returning, and then you can choose between 1 and 2 upgrade options. You can make it so that enemies are dazed while impaled with Twisting Blades, which of course makes them not have any actions. Or you can, when your Twisting Blades return, your active cooldowns are reduced. And this is where they nerfed it, because the active cooldowns reduced went way down. Now it's only 0.25 second per enemy they pass through, up to 3 seconds, whereas before it was a hell of a lot more than that. Basically, people were using Twisting Blades to reset all their cooldowns continuously, and you can still use it to reset your cooldowns. It's just not as powerful as it was before. There's also some passives in here. We have Sturdy, which is you gain 4% close damage reduction. And as we talked about earlier, close is melee range, so it's only going to have an effect if you are standing within melee range of the monster. Siphoning Strikes heal for 1% of your maximum life when you critically strike close enemies. Again, this is another melee option. So these 2 passives are really meant for the melee characters. Then we have Flurry. Flurry is unleash a flurry of stabs and slashes, striking enemies in front of you 4 times and dealing 60% damage to each. Enhanced Flurry is the upgrade for this, and each time a flurry damages a crowd control or vulnerable enemy, you are healed for 1% of your maximum life up to 12% of your maximum life per cast. Now, as you can see here, we have another crowd control or vulnerable buff. The entire tree is like this. And this is actually a pretty nice heal. 1% of your maximum life up to 12% is actually pretty nice. So you can utilize this to restore your HP, which could be a good option in boss battles as well as PvP. Improved Flurry. If Flurry hits a vulnerable enemy, it will make all enemies hit by that cast vulnerable for 3 seconds. So this is that's actually pretty cool, because if you get vulnerability from any other skill and then you hit that monster who was made vulnerable by your other skill, you could potentially make every monster nearby vulnerable, which sounds pretty powerful, especially since a lot of these abilities have huge buffs for monsters being vulnerable. And what is vulnerable? Vulnerable means 20% enhanced damage to the target. Evading through an enemy will cause your next flurry to stun enemies for 2.5 seconds. So 2 really nice options there. Basically free vulnerabilities or a nice little stun duration. 2.5 seconds is a pretty nice period of time. Then lastly, actually not lastly, we have 2 more. Now, another one of the ranged abilities is Penetrating Shot, which is fire an arrow that pierces through all enemies in a line, dealing 70% damage. This one's a little strange. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Magic Arrow with, like 100% pierce. The upgrade for this is Penetrating Shot deals 10% increased damage per enemy it pierces, so you're rewarded for playing the minigame of how many monsters can I hit with this ability at any given time. Improved Penetrating Shot. If Penetrating Shot damages at least 3 enemies, your next Penetrating Shot has a 20% increased critical strike chance. Again, another reward for piercing as many enemies as you can. And then Advanced Penetrating Shot. When cast with full energy, Penetrating Shot will slow all enemies, hit by 50% for 3 seconds. Elite enemies will also be knocked down for 1.5 seconds. So we've got some interesting upgrade paths here. You can go with the Pierce game, which is basically I can pierce as many monsters as I can, or you can go over into the option where you can get a little bit of slow and crowd control effects from the ability. We also have a passive here, which is critically striking an enemy grants a 5% movement speed bonus for 4 seconds, which could be very interesting for PvP, especially if you do a lot of kiting in PvP and things like that. It definitely could make it a little bit easier to get your character around the battlefield, as well as flee or even chase, depending on what's going on. The last one of the core skills is Rapid Fire. Rapid Fire seems a lot like Strafe. It fires 5 arrows, each dealing 24% damage, and basically it's just a bunch of arrows being fired very quickly. When I was playing around with these abilities, I think I did actually like this one better than Barrage. Enhanced Rapid Fire. Each subsequent arrow from Rapid Fire has 5% increased critical strike chance, up to a 40% for the 8th arrow. And then the 2 upgrade paths for this are Improved Rapid Fire, which is gain 15 energy per cast of Rapid Fire when it damages a vulnerable enemy. Again, another vulnerable buff. And then we also have Rapid Fire deals 30% increased critical strike damage for 3 seconds after you evade. Moving on to the next set of skills. I can't remember which one this one is. Which category this one is. This Subterfuge? I think this might be Subterfuge. Or maybe that one's Subterfuge. And this one's Stripper. I can't even remember what they are. It doesn't tell me. Shadow Step is Become Unstoppable, which is basically the way that you can shirk off all crowd control effects for a given period of time, and quickly move through the shadows to stab your victim from behind. Now, this one is a very interesting one because it allows you to move in to the group and attack somebody really quickly. And I was actually utilizing this with the traps for a little while so that I could move in and apply my traps directly behind the targets. And I actually found out that there was a little bit of a downside to this. So basically, when you use a melee ability on the rogue, it switches your damage out to the melee weapons. So if you don't have good melee weapons, which you need to actually take advantage of this, then your traps suffer because the damage of the traps will then be based off of the melee weapons because the last skill you used was a melee skill. So if you're going with Trapper and you're trying to utilize this for traps, do keep in mind that your traps will be at the power level of the last weapon you used, which is interesting. It also gains you a 50% movement speed for 2 seconds afterwards. The first upgrade for this is damaging an enemy with Shadow Step increases your critical strike chance against them by 8% for 3 seconds, which is nice, and also goes along with the traps because then when you drop your traps directly behind them, they get a nice little crit chance bonus versus them, which is definitely good. You can upgrade it in 2 different ways at the last upgrade, which is Disciplined Shadow Step. Shadow Step's cooldown is reduced by 3 seconds when it damages an enemy you have not hit with Shadow Step for the last 4 seconds. So basically this kind of lets you bounce around like a ping pong ball as long as you're not attacking the same monster multiple times. Methodical Shadow Step. Enemies damaged by Shadow Step are stunned for 2 seconds. So 2 very interesting pathways you can go. This one seems more like PvP to me because you Shadow Step in, stun them, and then just start ripping them to shreds, and they're stunned for that duration. They'll have to burn their Unstoppable ability to get out of it, and you can always hit them again with it later. Then we have 2 passives. The first one is gain 5% damage reduction against damage over time effects. So that's going to include things like burn damage, poison damage. I believe there's a lot of shadow damage, which is damage over time, bleed effects, things like that, which actually could come in really handy for PvP because honestly, stacking bleeds and various damage over time effects on people in PvP is a time-honored tradition to kill them, because even if they run away, even if they manage to escape, a lot of the times if you have enough damage over time effects on a target, you can still obliterate them from existence even if they do escape. The next one is gain 6% damage reduction while inflicted with control impairing effects. So again, another PvP one here, because if you are stunned, knocked down, dazed, slowed, chilled, frozen, whatever it may be, if they are hitting you with some type of control impairing effect, well, guess what? Now you have some damage bonuses. And that's 6% per level, so you get 6, 6, 6. Haha, I see what they did there. Next is Caltrops, and I absolutely love Caltrops. I played around with this quite a bit on the beta, and basically it's a ability that just throws down these big, huge, freaking like multi-sided nails on the ground, so that if anybody steps on them, they get slowed down really nicely by 30% damage and 50% slow. And it lasts for 6 seconds, which is actually pretty nice. And I beefed this thing up pretty considerably because I was always using it. It's just an absolutely amazing trap, and you may want to work it into your repertoire, even if you're not like a ranged character. The upgrade paths for this are enemies take 3% increased damage from you for each second that they are in the Caltrops, which is very nice. So you basically drop the Caltrops on the target, it slows them down, they're stuck in it for a little while, and you start wailing on them while they're stuck inside. Absolutely works great. The two upgrade paths are this, is you have a 5% increased critical strike chance against enemies inside your Caltrops, double this amount against vulnerable enemies, so again, another way that you can get a damage buff while they are standing inside the Caltrops. And then on top of that, we also have methodical Caltrops, which is Caltrops now deal cold damage and chills enemies for 20% per second. This will also eventually freeze them if it stacks to 100%, which, since it does it per second and the Caltrops last for 6 seconds, that means that it will always freeze them if they stand in it for the full duration, because it only takes 5 seconds to reach 100%. So they will get 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, which is going to bring them to 120%, which will definitely freeze them. And if you stack multiple on top of them, they freeze even faster. Now, freezing effects can come in handy for the group as well, because there's lots of different characters that can get bonuses for freezing effects, as well as this character has some. We also have some more passives. So after knocking back or knocking down an enemy, you gain 5% increased critical strike chance against them for 3 seconds. We also have, when you critically strike a dazed enemy, they are knocked down for 5.5 seconds. So as you can see here, these two kind of go together, because after knocking back or knocking down an enemy, and this one is like, well, if you crit a dazed enemy, they'll get knocked down. So it gives you a way to knock down the monster to get that particular buff from the first one. And then we also have rapid gambits. Your evade cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds when you daze an enemy. So a lot of things to go around crowd control effects here. Next we have Dash. Dash was actually a pretty good one. And Dash is basically just kind of like an enhanced evade. And I did utilize it quite a bit until I didn't have room on my bar for it anymore. But when you play around with it, you'll get what I mean. Enemies damaged by Dash take 20% increased critical strike damage from you for 5 seconds. And then you can upgrade it as well. Dealing damage to crowd-controlled enemies with Dash reduces its charge cooldown by 0.5 seconds up to 3 seconds per cast. And then Discipline Dash. Dash slows enemies hit by 30% for 3 seconds. Any enemy already slowed will be dazed for 2 seconds instead. There were also some nice legendary effects when it came to this, where you could basically drop smoke grenades and like stun grenades and stuff, like when you dash and like when you finished your dash and things like that. And it got kind of interesting with the legendary effects added in. It was definitely kind of cool. The last one is a passive, which is Weapon Mastery, and this one is kind of interesting because it offers multiple bonuses depending on what weapon you're using. So if you are using daggers, you get 5% increased critical damage, 5% increased damage to healthy enemies, which is 85% or higher. If you're using swords, you get 3% increased damage just flat. If you're using bows, you get 4% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and crossbows is 5% increased critical strike damage. So an interesting one that you can beef up depending on which weapon you're planning on using, bows or crossbows, swords or daggers, and gives you a reason to try and build specifically, swords or specifically daggers or specifically bows, etc. Next is there's a bunch of traps in this tree too. So, we've got I can't remember which tree this one is called, but this is one of the later trees, and it does have some passives in it. So the first one is using a cooldown, increases your dodge chance by 4% for 3 seconds, and then we also have while stealth, you heal for 3% maximum life per second. Now I do think this one is pretty powerful, and it could be kind of crazy in PvP, because if you beef this up to max, that's 369, so you could get a 9% maximum life heal per second while you're stealthed, which means that in PvP it could be very easy to abuse this to stealth away, heal up a little bit, and then come back and attack again. And if you continually do this, stealth away, heal up, stealth away, heal up, stealth away, heal up, you could potentially wear someone down through attrition. So if a battle is very close in nature, just the fact that you can just stealth away and heal at basically any time will lead to an advantage to your side. Of course, that's assuming that they can't just one-shot you. Concealment is vanishes from sight, gaining an advanced form of stealth for 4 seconds that will not be removed by taking damage. That doesn't mean you can't die, by the way. So they might still be able to kill you while you're stealth, but you won't be able to have your stealth broken. Concealment also makes you unstoppable and grants you a 30% movement speed and allows you to move freely through enemies for its duration. Using an attack skill during concealment will break the concealment. So you can break it yourself, but they can't break you out of it. Which means that this skill and this passive are probably going to go very well together. Next is you gain 40 energy when you enter concealment, which is a pretty nice little boon to your resource pool. And then you can do 2 upgrades for this, which is the skill that breaks concealment always makes enemies vulnerable for 6 seconds. Or you can do the skill that breaks concealment will always be a guaranteed critical strike, which is a pretty powerful one right there. Having a guaranteed crit is pretty nice. Next is smoke grenades, and I was talking about these earlier when it came to the dash ability, because there are some legendaries that can allow you to drop smoke grenades when you dash. So keep that in mind. I think there's another one that allows you to do like stun grenades when you do a shadow step or something like that. I can't remember the exact wording, but they're pretty cool. They basically just give you the ability to drop grenades and stuff when you dash around. Now, smoke grenade drops a smoky concoction that dazes enemies for 4 seconds. They can still chase you, but they can't attack you for 4 seconds, which is kind of nice. Enhanced smoke grenade. Enemies affected by a smoke grenade take 15% increased damage from you. And then we also have countering smoke grenade. Lucky hit, dealing direct damage to enemies affected by smoke grenade, has up to a 25% chance to reduce the cooldown by 1 second, or by 3 seconds instead if the enemy is vulnerable. If an enemy is vulnerable, slowed, or chilled, then smoke grenade will daze them for 20% longer. So even more daze. Next is the poison trap, and I played around considerably with the poison trap, and I had a lot of fun with this one. It definitely is a very strong addition to a character. Basically just a trap that you put on the ground, and it does pretty massive damage over time. Basically, you just place the trap down that arms for 1.25 seconds, and after it activates, when the enemy moves within range, they take 344% poisoning damage over 9 seconds, and you can have up to 4 of these out at any given time. The first upgrade makes the poison trap knock down enemies for 1.5 seconds, which is absolutely great, and would go really good with the knockdown passive over here, which requires you to knock down a target, and you gain increased critical strike chance against them. So you could utilize this and this passive together to get a pretty nice little bonus, because you can knock down pretty much any enemy that enters your poison trap. Countering Poison Trap has a 30% chance to reset your Imbuement skill cooldowns when activated, and some of these Imbuement skills are actually pretty good, and we'll be going over those in a minute. Subverting Poison Trap, you deal 10% increased poison damage to enemies standing inside your poison trap. So there's a very interesting correlation here between this upgrade, which knocks them down, and this upgrade, which causes you to get extra damage. So if you choose this one, which is actually pretty nice, I would recommend this if you get the poison trap. It knocks them down for 1.5 seconds, and they're stuck in your trap for 1.5 seconds, right? Which means that you're going to get 10% increased damage guaranteed versus any monster that gets knocked down in your trap for 1.5 seconds. And then when they get up, it's going to take however long it takes them to exit the trap. And for that time period, you're going to get a pretty nice little damage bump. Not only from the 10% increased, of course, because they're stuck in it, but also the fact that they're knocked down, which is going to give you other bonuses, depending on if you have an ability that does extra damage or gives you extra crit chance to a monster that is, of course, knocked down. Then we have some passives here. So we've got you deal 6% increased damage to healthy and injured enemies. So basically, it gives you damage to any monster that's 85% health or higher and 35% health or lower, but you don't get the bonus if they are in between those numbers. So if they are 36% or higher or 84% or lower, you get no damage buff. But if they are healthy or injured, which is the really, really healthy and really, really injured, then you get a nice little damage bump. This was actually not bad because it's 6% per level, which brings you up to, what is that, 666? So, not bad. And then we have Malice, which is you deal 3% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. So another one that you would take if you're going with the vulnerable build. There's a lot of ways that you could take advantage of vulnerable damage here, and this is definitely a good one. And then finally, we have Dark Shroud. Dark Shroud kind of reminds me of Cloak of Shadows from Diablo 2. Surround yourself with up to 5 protective shadows. Gain 8% damage reduction per active shadow. Each time you take direct damage, that damage is reduced and the shadow is consumed. So it sounds a lot like Utsutsemi from Final Fantasy XI. Dark Shroud's shadows have a 10% chance to not be consumed. That would definitely be helpful. Countering Dark Shroud, while you have at least 4 active shadows from Dark Shroud, gain an 8% critical strike chance. That's a nice little bump. Each active shadow from Dark Shroud grants you 4% increased movement speed. I definitely would go with the crit strike chance, but that's if I was doing a crit build. Then we have some passives here as well, and each one of these is to do with the imbuement trees. So let's start with the one that isn't specifically to an element, which is imbued skills gain 3% increased critical strike chance, which stacks up to 3 times, so 3, 6, 9. So 9% increased critical strike chance when using an imbuement. We also have the shadow imbuement bonuses, which is shadow damage has up to a 10% chance to stun enemies for 0.5 seconds. And then we also get the each time you kill an enemy with a shadow damage, you generate 10 energy. The shadow imbuement is really interesting because it causes all sorts of little explosions. And in the beta, it was pretty overpowered. It was definitely the clear winner of all 3 of the imbuments. And they kind of brought it down a little bit more to earth. It's still pretty good, though. Imbue your weapon with festering shadows, and your next 2 imbued skills deal shadow damage and infect enemies for 6 seconds. Infected enemies explode on death, dealing 40% damage to all surrounding enemies, and if the infection expires before the enemy dies, it deals 40% damage to only that enemy. Now, from what I noticed with this particular ability, it works really good in large groups. Not so good against bosses, but very good when you're fighting large groups of enemies. We also have the Enhanced Shadow Imbuement, which is you have 50% increased critical strike chance against injured enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement, which is very nice. Combine that with the critical strike chance here, and you've got, 9% there and 15% there. So it's not bad. It has some pretty high crit chances. You can also choose between Blended Shadow Imbuement, which is Shadow Imbuement's primary explosion makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds, another vulnerability. Or you can go with enemies infected by Shadow Imbuement take 12% increased non-physical damage from you for 8 seconds. Poison, which seems to be the highest in terms of single target damage, is imbue your weapons with lethal poison. Your next 2 imbuable skills deal poison damage and apply 100 of their base damage as additional poisoning damage over 5 seconds. Poison imbuements, poison duration is increased by 1 second for the first upgrade, and then you can choose between critical strikes with poison imbued skills deal 75% increased poison damage, or lucky hit and poison imbued skills have up to a 30% chance to apply double the amount of poisoning damage over time. It's kind of interesting. Especially considering this character has I think a lucky hit improvement skill. Now, for the passives, for the poison imbuement, we've got Deadly Venom, which is you deal 3% increased poisoning damage, which could also come in handy for the poison traps, of course. And then we also have the Debilitating Toxins, which is poison enemies deal 5% less damage, so it gives you a little bit of a protection if the monster is poisoned. Could be useful for bosses, especially since you could stack that up to 3 times, so 15%. Alchemical Advantage, you gain 1% increased attack speed for each enemy you've poisoned up to 15%, which you could stack multiple times up to 3% increased attack speed for each enemy. And some nice little bonuses to the poison tree here. Then we have the Frost Imbuement, the Cold Imbuement, which is imbue your weapons with frigid energies. Your next two imbuable skills deal cold damage and chill enemies for 25% per hit. Now, this can lead to monsters being frozen, and if combined with the cold caltrops, it could equate to some pretty nice chill and freezing effects, which, by the way, both count as crowd control abilities. Enhanced Cold Imbuement. Cold imbued skills have to a 30% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds, another vulnerability. We also have Blended Cold Imbuement. Lucky Hit. Critical strikes with cold imbued skills have up to a 20% chance to instantly freeze enemies for 3 seconds, which I don't really think you necessarily need, especially if you combine it with other cold type abilities so that you have multiple cold type abilities running. You probably won't need that one specifically. The other one is cold imbued skills deal 20% damage to crowd controlled enemies, double this bonus against a frozen enemy, so to 40%. And then the two passives for this tree are you deal 5% increased damage to chilled enemies. This bonus increases to 10% against frozen enemies, which can be stacked 3 times, so 5, 10, 15, or 10, 20, 30. And then chilled enemies have their movement speed further reduced by up to 10%, which can be stacked to 30%. So you're going to be able to slow monsters really slow if you burn this one. And if you combine this one, stack this 3 times, and put this with this one, you are going to end up with a 50% slow here, and then a 30% slow here. Combined with how much chilling effect already slows the target, which means the monsters will be at pretty much a standstill when you're talking about the combination of chilling weight, the chilling caltrops, and the caltrops themselves, which could make a very powerful combination. Next is the Ultimate Tree, and the Ultimate Tree has things like Shadow Clone. Shadow Clone basically mimics your actions for 15 seconds, and she does about 60% of your damage. And I heard people raving about this one, telling me it was so good, and I tried it out, and I don't know, I hated it. Like, she would often attack in the wrong direction. I would use it, and then she would just, like, shoot her shot, just I don't even know, just completely like at a random wall or something, and it would piss me off. And yeah, if she attacked in the same direction as you, like, it would work. Like, it did pretty good when she actually, like, you know, attacked the same target as you, but most of the time she just kind of like whatever way she was facing when you use your ability, she just uses her ability, and it just kind of like goes off into nowhere land. I don't know. I didn't particularly like it, but I could see how it could be pretty powerful if you could get the Shadow Clone to not be a derp. You also get Unstoppable for 5 seconds after using the Shadow Clone, which could be powerful. And then on top of that, your Shadow Clone deals an additional 20% of your damage. So instead of 60%, it would be 80% of your damage, so closer to a full strike. Then we have some passive. So we got Lucky Hit, up to a 10% chance to gain 8 energy, which could, of course, be stacked 3 times. So I'm pretty sure that would go to 30% chance to gain 8 energy. And then we also have the non-physical damage you deal has a 5% increased Lucky Hit chance, which could come in handy for some of these abilities, like, for instance, this Lucky Hit Poison Imbuement, which is giving you double the amount of poison damage. So if you did Mixed Imbuement, it'd probably be a good idea to grab this one as well, because poison damage counts as non-physical, and then you would get a 5, 10, 15 additional percentage bonus added on to this 30%, so you would be at 45% chance to apply double poisoning damage over time, which would be pretty nice. There's also, for every 100 energy you spend, you gain 5% increased Lucky Hit chance for 5 seconds. So again, this one could also be useful here. So if you grab this one and this one together, you might be able to get your Lucky Hit chance pretty darn high. especially for non-physical damage. Then we also have Trap Mastery, which is when Poison Trap or Death Trap activates, you gain 4% increased critical strike chance against vulnerable enemies and crowd-controlled enemies for 4 seconds, which of course can be stacked up to 3 times. Then we have Death Trap. Now, I played around a lot with Death Trap, and it's interesting. I actually kind of preferred the Poison Trap and Caltrops to the Death Trap. I thought it was a little lackluster, but I really couldn't beef it up entirely. It's basically a big giant area, and when anything steps within the area, like it just unleashes hell on the area, and you can put a couple of them down. I think it was 3, I can't remember, but it's interesting. It's interesting. It does have a function that allows you to pull enemies in when it activates, which does make it hit more monsters, which is kind of nice. And then the Supreme Death Trap is if the Death Trap kills an enemy, its cooldown is reduced by 10 seconds, which definitely does help a bit, and I couldn't get access to that in the beta, but I would imagine that being able to reduce the cooldown would definitely help a lot with this ability, because it didn't really seem powerful enough to warrant the 50-second cooldown that it had. But I definitely could imagine that with this and the proper abilities, you could probably get a lot better use from it. So if you're going to build a Trapper rogue, this is an interesting one, but I wouldn't focus on this one specifically until later. I would probably focus more on Caltrops and Poison Trap to begin with, and then grab Death Trap later once you've got everything kind of set up. We also have another passive here, which is after using an ultimate skill, restore 25 energy. We have Adrenaline Rush, which is while moving, you gain 5% increased energy regeneration. We have Impetus, which is after moving 15 meters, your next attack deals 7% increased damage. And then we've got Haste, which is while at or above 50% maximum energy, gain 5% increased movement speed, while below 50% maximum energy, gain 5% increased attack speed. Then finally we have Rain of Arrows. Now Rain of Arrows has some interesting effects, and basically it just rains down a huge amount of arrows over a large area with 100% damage, and it does it 2 times. So the waves are just kind of just like hitting everything on the screen at that particular point. You can set it up so the Imbuement skill effects applied to Rain of Arrows. So if you have like, Poison Imbuement, Shadow Imbuement, Cold Imbuement, it will apply to Rain of Arrows, which is kind of nice, but it has a 20% potency. And then the final one is Rain of Arrows second wave knocks down enemies for 3 seconds. Now, I did find a legendary when I was playing for Rain of Arrows, which basically made it so that Rain of Arrows would apply all imbuments to it when you fire it, which sounds pretty OP because it would get the shadow, the poison, and the cold all at once, and seems like it would be pretty crazy with all those effects on there. Then finally we have the capstones. Now the capstones are kind of like a general guide, I've noticed, for like making builds, but not really the end all be all of what you're going to do. First off, we have exposure, which is dealing direct damage to an enemy affected by a trap skill, has up to a 25% chance to reduce the active cooldowns of your trap skills by 20% and drop a cluster of exploding stun grenades that deal 40% total physical damage and stun enemies for 0.50 seconds. So this is basically what you would pick if you're going to be a trapper. Then we also have Victimize, which is lucky hit, direct damage to a vulnerable enemy, has up to a 30% chance to cause an explosion, dealing 23% of its original damage to them and surrounding enemies, which sounds a lot like Corpse Explosion, but it does require the monsters to be vulnerable. Now, as you saw, we were going through the tree, there's tons of different ways that you can make monsters vulnerable. So definitely an easy thing to do on a rogue. Then we have Precision, which is critical strikes with marksman skills grant you precision, gets you 4% increased critical strike damage per stack of precision, up to a maximum of 20%. When you reach a maximum precision, your next marksman skill is guaranteed to critical strike. That deals 40% increased critical strike damage, then consumes all stacks of precision. So this is basically for your ranged character. This is going to be one that you would choose if you're going to strictly be a ranged rogue, like trying to be an Amazon from Diablo 2. Then we have Close Quarters Combat, which is damaging a close enemy with Marksman or Cutthroat skills. Each grant 10% increased attack speed bonus for 8 seconds. While both attack speed bonuses are active, you deal 20% increased damage against crowd-controlled enemies. Now notice the keyword here, close enemy. So close enemy is melee range. So even though Marksman was included in this, this is a melee ability. It's something that requires you to be basically right up in the face of the monster to get that damage bonus. And then finally, we have Cutthroat skills grant a stack of movement for 8 seconds if they are either hit a stunned, dazed, or frozen enemy, hit any enemy from behind while at 3 stacks of momentum. You gain 20% increased damage reduction, 30% increased energy regeneration, and 15% increased movement speed. Now, this one strikes me as more of a stealth-based character. So if I had to quantify these capstones in order, Trapper, definitely Trapper. This one is vulnerable, which could be either ranged or melee. There's a lot of vulnerable effects in this tree. So this is really just vulnerable. Like if you're going to go with a vulnerable build. And it's also a lucky hit, so do pay attention to that as well. So you may have to build vulnerable and lucky hit for this. This one right here is pretty much strictly ranged, and then this one right here is strictly melee, and then this one is more of what I would consider to be a stealth/crowd control character. And they definitely make good additions to whatever builds that you might want to do. In closing, I know I've been going for quite some time. The Rogue is just an absolutely crazy character with so many different ways to build. I mean, you can be a ranged character. You can be a melee character. You can be a ranged/melee character. You can be a stealth character. You can be a stealth ranged character. You can be a stealth melee character. You can be a stealth ranged melee character. You can be a trapper. You can add in traps to any of those builds I just stated. You can build for crowd control. You can build for crits. You can build for vulnerabilities. You can build for lucky hit. I mean, honestly, the number of builds in this tree are kind of endless, and I hope that I've at least given you some ideas on maybe how you want to build your character. In the future, as we go along, I might theory craft a bunch of builds for these characters, and it'll definitely be fun to try and make up a build here or there and see if it works. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when I yak for like 51 minutes on the Rogue. And as always, keep watching.